What do you think about the idea of a sort of nuclear umbrella? This idea, I think it was posed ages ago now, or maybe a year ago even, that the French and the British could somehow replace the nuclear assurances by the Americans. Is that something that's even possible?
I think we need the US just in terms of sheer quantity. Obviously here in the UK, they're looking at a new form of nuclear weapons. So we'd have the F-35 aircraft, we'd get F-35As and have be able to deliver nukes that way. Obviously there was also this discussion about whether the French would, at the moment, the French's nuclear capability, it's just for the French to defend France, whereas they wouldn't use it to defend another NATO ally or to hit back.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of geopolitics, economics, and international relations. And, well, I could say that I've been on the news now, which is very exciting. Do check out the channel if you want to see my appearance on the BBC or other things. But anyway, my plugs aside, I'm delighted to be talking to Larisa Brown, who is the defence editor at the Times newspaper in the UK, one of the most, I think, prestigious and important voices on defence for the UK, but also, of course, broader European dynamics. And given that the peace talks in Geneva between the Russians, the Ukrainians, mediated by the US, have unsurprisingly resulted in nothing, well, it's important to consider the European element in this. Geneva is the first time that the talks have been hosted in Europe, shall we say, since Putin's full-scale invasion. And does that mean that Russia's getting a little bit more aware that it has to take perhaps concessions? But who knows? Larisa, it's delightful to have you on. We've got quite an array of things we're going to cover. I think the best place to really start is we've just had the Munich Security Conference finish. And I don't know if you were present at that, but what's your assessment of sort of the UK, the European security and defence architecture at the moment?
Yes, I was at Munich for a short time, a couple of days. I've been covering Munich actually for years now, and every year it gets more frustrating because they push back the security area, which means that the press are actually quite far away from the main event. So you have to sort of fight to get in there amongst all the diplomats and military chiefs. And when I was inside, I managed to speak to the chair of the NATO's military committee and also the spokesperson for SACEUR. And I thought it's quite interesting at the moment. There's obviously a huge push for the Europeans to obviously step up their defence, to also make sure they've got industry ready and primed to actually be able to accelerate any procurement programmes very quickly. I think there is some concern among the Americans especially that you might have all these grand announcements about spending on defence in the next few years, but actually you haven't got the industry behind that. People aren't able to just suddenly spend billions more pounds on defence. So I think that was one of the concerns there. And there was also a big push for the European countries to come together and say, look, we're going to try and save money by launching these joint ventures together to develop various weapons capabilities rather than all doing it alone. And so that's sort of what I kind of gathered from Munich in the initial first few hours.
Yeah, I was meant to go, and then for one reason or another, it fell through. But from the people I've spoken to who did go, like yourself, there's this sort of sense that despite the grand pledges or slogans, there's still, behind closed doors, a still lacking of urgency among certain capitals in Europe. That there's a degree of complacency, or as I think some people have called it, European time, right? Is that something that you get a sense of? That the words and the actions are still pretty disconnected?
I mean, that's absolutely the case. So, for example, today I'm writing about defence spending here in the UK, and are we going quick enough? And I've spoken to one senior government source in the MOD who's saying to me that, we should have been reaching 3% of spending on defence already. Obviously, the UK commitment at the moment is let's not spend 3% until next Parliament. So Labour might not even be in power by then. Right. And there are these discussions taking place about whether you bring forward that commitment and try and spend 3% on defence in this Parliament. But the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, it still needs to be convinced about that. And of course, that would cost taxpayers billions of pounds a year. And I'm not sure the British public are quite ready for that yet. And there's also a sense here that we don't really hear from the military chiefs that often. And I think part of the reason that is that the military chiefs would tell us, we need to be ready for war now. War with Russia could come very soon in the next few years. And that doesn't quite correlate with the government announcements and the government promise at the moment to not yet spend that money on defence. It doesn't all work together.
So I'll come to the UK specifically in just a second, but a provocative question for you is that often, we're hearing that Russia poses an immediate military threat to the continent, and yet they can't seem to do anything in Ukraine. Their territorial control has barely shifted beyond 20% of Ukraine in 4 years. So what is this? Is it that Russia is a threat or it isn't? How do we square that circle?
I think there's a couple of things. One, there's the threat of hybrid warfare, which obviously doesn't rely on conventional defense. So, not talking about tanks and troops, we're talking about cyber attacks and disinformation, which they're very good at. But I think also what the concern is here, especially, and also in other European countries, is that if there is a peace deal, which obviously everybody hopes there is, then if it's a good deal for Putin, then he might think, well, actually, I'm going to try again in a few years' time, and he will be able to continue at a wartime pace in terms of building up his military machine, and he will be preparing for a wider war with Europe. And if we're not doing the same thing and we're not building up our military capabilities, then we're going to be in a very, very vulnerable position.
No, that's fair enough. I just think it's interesting because obviously Putin's goal was to try to dismantle NATO, and he's made it much stronger with the addition of Sweden and Finland. But what I think is interesting in the UK context is that Russia, or the Kremlin, now sees Britain as enemy number one, more than the United States. I think we've seen this published in white papers or official statements, right? Is that the assessment that you get from people you speak to, that the British military community sees Russia as being, having them in their spotlight now?
Well, I think everyone here is quite hawkish when it comes to Russia, whereas obviously we've got Donald Trump in power in the United States, and no one's ever really sure what exactly his opinion is. And clearly the Russians think that they can use him in some sense and have a better relationship with him, whereas that's not going to happen here. Everybody's very vocal, whether it's the ministers or the military chiefs, on the threat from Russia. And ever since Sergei Skripal, the poisoning a few years ago in Salisbury, people have been really, really tough on their stance on Russia. And I've not seen any suggestion that we would be we're ready to be weaker on that. And actually, in the last few weeks, we've heard a lot from John Healey, the Defence Secretary, about trying to crack down on those shadow vessels that are coming through the channel. And I think there's a genuine sense that we need to try and ramp up the impact of this war on Putin, send them more military equipment, more financial assistance, and also try and stop Putin from getting, the money that he needs to carry on that war. But obviously, we're lacking here in our own ammunition and stockpiles. So that's obviously a real worry.
No, it is. And just to come to Britain, and I'll come to Europe in a moment about the shadow fleet aspect, I'm glad you brought that up, and I wonder what people watching think, so they should leave their own comments below. What's the general assessment of the state of the UK military right now? I feel that we've got a manpower shortage. Military chief, I saw in your latest article just today that the RAF has admitted that it will struggle to operate in the Arctic, in the high north, as NATO calls it. Could you give us a lay of the land, so to speak?
I think that the key figure here is that the MOD is short of £28 billion over the next 4 years, which is obviously a huge sum of money. And Rich Knighton, the chief of the Defence Staff, told this to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, just before Christmas. And the Prime Minister was obviously extremely angry about this, because his impression was that the Strategic Defence Review that we got last year was fully costed. And that isn't the case. And I'm told that the chiefs, the departments, the services are having to look into how they'd be able to cut things in their services, rather than actually looking at, have extra cash coming in the next year or two to spend on big modernisation programmes. And that's obviously a real worry, because that doesn't, chime with the threat picture that we've got at the moment. And I think, there's so many concerns in terms of homeland defence. We haven't really got much in terms of protecting the UK. That's an increasing worry. We also haven't got the stockpiles, not got the ammunition. If there was a long war, we would be out of it very quickly. We'd be defeated because we wouldn't be able to keep going. The problem with the war in Ukraine is that Russia every day is building up its capabilities and learning how to fight better, whereas we're not doing that. And I think that's also, our preparedness for something on the scale of the Ukraine war is really lacking.
No, I think that's a fair point. The one consideration I would say is that I made a video just yesterday about the Russian economy because we talk about it a lot on the show. And one of the things I think is notable is that the economy is getting to such an overheated sense that it's beginning to eat itself. So sure, Russia's in that wartime footing and it has that immediate expertise, as does Ukraine, to be fair, as you say. But for me, it's that economic element that could be a real Achilles heel to Russia because it needs the war now to sustain itself. But equally, the longer it continues, the more it cannibalizes itself. So it's that weird paradox. But obviously now we've got the British government having to make some tricky decisions. Starmer's not exactly having an easy time with certain appointees and a whole bunch of files, which I'm not going to mention because it's too many mentions already. But what's the state of sort of the political mindset, if that makes sense, in Downing Street versus the military branch? Because the relationship between the military and the political is always imperative when it comes to having these things in good shape, right?
Yeah, I think there's sort of a slowness at decision making. I think that's becoming a bit of a problem, and I know that those, we've been waiting for this defence investment plan, which will spell out exactly how the military is going to spend its money. And the chiefs are really keen to get that published because that gives assurances to industry. It gives an indication of where everything's going. It enables the service chiefs to know what they can buy, where the money's coming in, for what projects. And that's obviously a really key thing. And yet that was meant to be published, I think initially we were told last autumn. Now, we're in February. It's extraordinary. And I think that's causing a lot of problems. And the chiefs have apparently, given all of their suggestions and choices to the ministers, and it's still sitting with the ministers. So that, clearly a decision has got to be made pretty quickly on all of that. And I think that is a big problem.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of Starmer versus the chiefs, I think it's more that the chiefs need to be able to persuade the prime minister to spend more on defence is how I see it. They've obviously not been able to do that in the last few months, not since we had that commitment last year at the NATO summit and ahead of the NATO summit as well. There's been a lot of reluctance by Starmer to spend money on defence. I would say that's for definite.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. There's a weird dynamic here where they make these statements. They say we need to bring things forward, but then they don't follow through with the policy shifts. And I've got a sort of two-pronged question for you on that, which is, from my understanding, the US-UK relationship is pretty fractured. I'm rather skeptical of the whole special relationship, to be honest, these days. But one of the aspects to that is that the British government, there's so much reliance on the US for certain components or industrial equipment. I'm not as informed of it as you are. So how much of that is a problem for the UK specifically? But also, what is the internal political divisions, the continued pressure of reform, the Conservatives doing on Starmer's mindset, the decision making? Is that part of his problem as well?
I mean, in terms of the sort of relationship between the US and the UK, the armed forces of both are really intertwined, and it's extremely hard to separate us. And that's not just in terms of, joint defence projects and obviously the nuclear deterrent, but also just things like you've got Americans embedded with the UK forces in various countries and vice versa. We've obviously got the US bases here. There's lots of exchange programs that, I just think if you wanted to suddenly fight alone, we'd find it, or fight without the US, we'd find it really difficult to separate the two. There's one, a lot of sort of materials as well that we rely on, getting from America to then be able to build up our own weapons capabilities. That's also an issue that's been described to me before. And I think actually defence companies here are really trying to change that. They are trying to become more sovereign and ensure that they've got their own sovereign capabilities. So if a war did kick off, we aren't suddenly relying on importing ammunition or explosives material from the US, which we might have had to do before.
You mentioned that the public is not perhaps got the appetite for more defense spending, but clearly we need to take shifts. Do we need to cut welfare? Do we need to cut in certain areas so that we can meet these spending targets and so that Rachel Reeves can commit to her, not going over or expanding the deficit, et cetera, these self-imposed financial rules that she's made?
I think, obviously there's been a lot of U-turns by this government, but I think when it comes to, like supporting Ukraine, for example, I can't see that, that changing anytime soon. Yeah, it's kind of, it's a tricky one really, because I think the British public feel that, they'd rather see the money being spent on the NHS. There's obviously a huge question over the welfare state, and there's too much money going into the welfare state. And I think a lot of the people that I speak to would say that they want that money to be going into defence. But clearly Starmer will have done the research, presumably, and perhaps Labour voters might not think like that as a whole. So it's a fine line. And I think maybe there needs to be a sort of point where they're like, wow, the threat from Russia is so immediate that we need to ramp up defence spending really quickly. And I guess the problem with that will be that, yes, you might give an extra billion or two to the head of the Air Force, but then he's not going to be able to spend it immediately. It doesn't work like that. He won't be able to just suddenly have 10 new aircraft. In fact, if war suddenly did start with Russia, you'd have a scramble, across Europe and America and other countries to try and buy everything up to quickly have the defense capability. And so I think you need to have a plan in place that is a quick plan, but you're helping defense industry at the same time build up the capabilities and doing it with them.
I've got a slightly different question for you, but at the beginning of the year, after Operation Absolute Resolve and Venezuela, there's obviously a lot of discussion about the ideological aspect of what Trump does, his views or dissent for Europe, particularly after Vance's Munich Security speech last year, which Rubio seemed to try to sort of dilute this time around. But the point I'm more interested in is that the UK obviously wants to retain that relationship with the United States. We're critical of Trump's use or approach to Venezuela, but then at the same time, we provide military support when they acquired that tanker. I forget the name of it, the one that was, just off Green Iceland. Is there not a problem here? The British need to be willing to be consistent with international law, but then they're willing to support the Trump administration in these actions, if you know what I mean.
The UK government gets criticised a lot, doesn't it, for being quite weak when it comes to standing up to Trump. And what I found quite interesting was, I'm sure you'll remember Trump's comments about troops that served in Afghanistan, and he was suggesting that the British forces didn't serve on the front line. And I thought the UK response really surprised me, because the government for once actually came out and was pretty strong on it. Starmer, effectively said that if he was Trump, then he would be thinking about apologising. And we had all the defence ministers come out too. And it actually worked, because it did make Trump say something. And maybe that was kind of an example of where you don't want to just, sort of quiver in the background. If you say anything that might upset him, you're going to be slapped with trade tariffs. And actually, sometimes it does work. And I think a lot of the Democrats in the US as well are trying to persuade the Europeans to stand up more to Trump. But the way it was described to me as by one European diplomat was, in a few years' time, hopefully we'll be in a place where we can defend ourselves and we're not so reliant on America. But, at the moment, the situation is that we need the US to defend us and to protect European security. So we can't really go too far in criticising him, because the risks are so huge.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I was one of those people who was incredibly vocal of just my disdain for Trump's comments and the lack of response initially from Starmer's government, and then they did, and I'm glad that they did. I just wish it was a little bit more often. Maybe not, really strongly worded, but at least just being defiant enough to speak in the face of absolute garbage. Anyway, Europe, because I think it's important to look at the UK relationship within Europe, obviously. Starmer's said he's going to deploy the sort of warships, this carrier strike group, to the Arctic later this year. I was hoping you could explain a little bit more about that and how it plays into sort of the broader push of European strategic autonomy.
Well, I suppose I'm a bit skeptical of all this sort of talk about the High North, because it only really seemed to be a massive thing when Trump started talking about Greenland. And I've spoken to quite a few different experts over the months who have said that actually the threat in the Arctic region has kind of reduced a little bit since Russia went into Ukraine, because Russia's so busy invading its neighbour. And then yet we're doubling our marine footprint in Norway. We're sending the aircraft carrier, which is a big message as well. And I guess in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, is that where the threat is? Is that where we should be sending all of our resources? I don't know. I think there is people that share my skepticism about this mission. Obviously, NATO is talking a lot about what they're doing in the High North too, and it does just feel an awful lot like all the Europeans scrambling to placate Trump.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Russia can't sustain itself in Africa. It can't sustain itself in the Caucasus. I mean, Trump somehow engineered, well, it's more of an IOU than it is a MOU than an actual peace deal, right, between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So to try and deal with anything in the High North and the Arctic is, I think, a stretch, definitely. But I guess, what's your opinion of Starmer's approach to integrating with Europe? Do you think that he's going about it the right way with, say, the E3, i.e. Germany and France, or do you think that there are other things that he should be doing?
I think he's trying to do joint defence programmes. He's doing a lot with the Germans, a lot with the French. I think that seems sensible to me, given what the US is doing at the moment. And obviously he wants to save money on big programmes. So to me, there is a huge push to working more with the Europeans. You get less negative briefings about each other now. Diplomats seem to be working much better together. And I think it kind of makes sense given the threat that Russia poses.
What do you think about the idea of a sort of nuclear umbrella? This idea, I think it was posed ages ago now, maybe a year ago even, that the French and the British could somehow replace the nuclear assurances by the Americans. Is that something that's even possible?
No, I think in terms of, we need the US just in terms of sheer quantity. Obviously here in the UK, they're looking at a new form of nuclear weapon. So we'd have the F-35 aircraft, would get F-35As and have be able to deliver nukes that way. Obviously there was also this discussion about whether the French would. At the moment, the French's nuclear capability, it's just for the French, it's to defend France, whereas they wouldn't use it to defend another NATO ally or to hit back. So there was discussion about that. But the last conversation I had with some of the French contacts that I have, that seemed to have sort of fallen away. So I'm not sure that that's something that's being talked about at the moment.
But so setting aside the French for a second then, where do we see the British taking a leadership role? Is it in areas of intelligence, cybernetics? I do personally think that the UK still has that comparative advantage there relative to some other members of the continent. But as we saw, I think it was in late last year, the French led a NATO exercises in Romania, and all it revealed was the huge gaps that exist without America's provision of particularly, I think, logistics. What's your takeaways there?
I should have mentioned that earlier. We are so reliant on the Americans for logistics, for supply trucks. And yes, we might be able to send, some soldiers somewhere, but we would need the Americans for all the enablers that would be necessary to fight for a long period of time. So that is a real crucial point. In terms of what we offer, we've got the nuclear deterrent, and whenever I go to briefings or speeches about sort of what the UK provides to NATO countries, there's a lot of emphasis on the nuclear deterrent and its importance, and a huge amount of the defence budget goes towards the deterrent as well. And there are people questioning whether that needs to come out of the defence budget, because it wasn't always in the defence budget. And that might make life a lot easier for the service chiefs, who would have an awful lot more money to spend on other things. And in terms of other stuff, that I had quite a surprising briefing the other day. I said that we're all friends now in Europe, but I did have a briefing from a few European sources that said that they were frustrated with the UK because they felt that there were deployments, missions, operations with the navies, and the Royal Navy didn't have enough ships, and they were concerned about that. And we were preoccupying ourselves with going to the Far East rather than helping patrol waters closer to home. And also in terms of the size of the army, it's only around 70,000 strong, and that also concerns our friends in Europe because they think it's just too small. And when you look at what we could provide to any coalition of the willing force in Ukraine, we're talking about very small numbers that could be sustained there for a long period of time.
Yeah, we had a great conversation with General Petraeus, who was the head of the NATO forces in Afghanistan for a time, and I asked him this sort of question about the relationship of manpower, because Britain has a fundamental shortfall in its manpower that seems to be a reoccurring theme across Europe. But some people argue that drones can sort of replace that. I personally am skeptical. What's your thoughts? Have you heard anything to the contrary from people you've spoken to?
There's a push, obviously, towards more drones. Gwyn Jenkins, our head of the Navy, wants to have this hybrid force where you've got, obviously, the crewed vessels and the uncrewed vessels all working together, powered by AI. And in terms of the Navy, there is talk about, you won't need as many sailors in future because, yes, you'll have all these vessels that are uncrewed. Soldiers on the ground, yes, drones are going to be absolutely vital. You just need to look at the front line in Ukraine to see that you've got miles of territory where there are just drones and no humans at all. But that isn't going to be able to just replace troops altogether. And soldiers is incredibly small. They could all be gone in a few days, weeks, if they were fighting a war on the scale of Ukraine. So I think they're going to have to massively try and increase that. But that is the problem here. So Healy has said that he would like to increase the size of the army, but they're really struggling to keep people in the military once they join. A lot of people leave, and they're recruiting more people over the last few months than they were previously. But it's not enough to stop the outflow being larger than the inflow.
No, I think there's a general concern about our generations, right? Millennials or young millennials like myself, and Zoomers, I forget, Gen Zs, right? Or even Gen Alphas, are they old enough yet? I don't know. But yeah, no, there's a real sort of consideration about the willingness to fight. And we've seen that, though, in Ukraine, even, that a large proportion of Ukrainians in the age range of 18 to 25 have left the country because they don't want to fight. But who can blame them and such? So, yeah, I guess... My penultimate question for you is simply from the geostrategic angle. We saw in early January, I think, which I didn't cover because there's so much going on as well, but I thought was really notable, was that the French and the British cooperated on strikes against ISIS in the Middle East. And it got me thinking and wondering whether this is something that we're going to see more of. These two leading the way with the Europeans in being more willing to take steps. Is that something you get a sense of, or it's just too early to tell?
In quieter times, that would have been a big story. Just, I think people have forgotten that ISIS is still a threat in Syria and Iraq. You think that it's something that happened years ago, but yes, of course, it's still a threat. And we've obviously got a lot of British citizens as well in northeastern Syria, and that's actually I think quite a few of them have been moved to Iraq, but generally that is also a concern for military chiefs and obviously security officials that I speak to, and I think that is going to become an increasing problem over the coming months and years. And it's quite important for security services like MI6 and the military to not just focus on the state threats, because then we might be surprised when we get an attack from a terrorist organization like ISIS, and Al Qaeda are still obviously very, very prevalent as well in some areas. So in terms of like joint strikes with the French, we've had quite a few operations together over the years, but I think we're obviously going to see more of that. I think also we're not going to shy away from helping America when we can, because clearly Starmer thinks that if we help them militarily, then it might help us diplomatically and economically. So I think Starmer's still really keen to maintain a really strong relationship with America while accepting that he needs to do more with the Europeans.
I know I said penultimate, but you made me think of one more thing, so I'm going to be cheeky and say this is the penultimate one, if that's all right. Which is simply, there's a lot of emphasis about continental Europe and the ideological outlook, the tug of war between populists, more traditional political figures and such. But one of the ironies, I think, is that with Trump's impacts, he's actually causing more right-wing people who'd never thought of the idea of a federal Europe beginning to think, well, for our own sovereignty and protection against the unpredictability, abrasion of the Trump administration, the idea of a federal Europe is perhaps more akin, more likely, more, suitable. What's your thoughts there? And where on earth would the UK fit into all that? I know that's a big question, but from a defense standpoint, we have to kind of consider these bigger picture scenarios, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say very generally that obviously, our relationship with America is not as good as it was a couple of years ago. And there are a lot of worries about that. And that is naturally going to push us close to the Europeans, because we haven't got the military that could possibly do it alone. We're absolutely dependent on our allies. And I think that a lot of people that see sense will realize that we've got to work more with the Europeans, including on defense projects that we might have been nervous about at the time of discussions on Brexit. In fact, I remember when, during the referendum, there was all this concern about doing any deals with the Europeans. Yeah. And now it's not people. I don't really get people messaging me being critical of a new partnership with France, Germany, or whoever, or is trying to buy into these defense project programs in Europe. It's much more collaborative, and I think that people are on board with that a lot more.
Yeah, no, I mean, I won't lie that this channel is incredibly pro-Europe, not blind to the shortcomings and limitations, but I wrote a piece for Newsweek a couple of weeks back about the sort of idea of principled pragmatism. It's sort of what Alexander Stubbs has called value-based realism. That's sort of similar, but like Europe needs to step up for itself. But anyway, very last question for you, Larisa, is simply what would you emphasize people to look out for? Because there's a lot happening. We've had sort of a couple of key global events now, the WF and Munich Security Conference. What's next as we enter spring?
Wow. What is next? I feel like there's so many things. Something always happens every week. I sort of start my day very quietly, and then by the end of the day, you've got some crazy comment on Twitter or Truth Social, and everything changes.
Oh, you have a Truth Social account? That's impressive. I've never touched it.
I think... Ukraine is going to be interesting, but it feels like every year we're talking about the same thing. I think there is talk about, potentially a spring offensive. That's definitely one to watch out for. And I think also at the moment, we're just waiting to see if anything's going to happen on Iran. And the mood music this morning seems to be quite positive towards some sort of agreement between the US and Iran. I think at any moment that can suddenly end with Trump declaring that he's going to move in on Iran. And I think that could have huge consequences in the region. And the British military is already preparing for that with sending aircraft to Cyprus and Qatar in recent weeks. And so that is sort of the area that I would be for.
So we had a half an hour conversation about the wrong topic. We should have spoken about America and Iran. No, of course, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Larisa, for your time. We will hopefully have you back for perhaps a discussion about the US angle and broader US-Iran dynamics. I'm rather worried about it given the military buildup, which I don't think I've ever seen such a quantity of assets going to the Middle East under Trump. But hey, he's the peacetime president, right? And forever was. Anyway, slight jokes aside. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching.
Thank you.
All the best. Speak soon. Take care.